Kite's absence from the first episode of the 2011 Hunter x Hunter anime is by far the biggest long-term issue with that adaptation. As I said in my previous Hunter x Hunter video, Kite's early introduction doesn't really affect my personal attachment to his character, but it does radically influence how an audience could view his relationship with Gon. In both the manga and the 99 anime, Kite not only played a key part in defining Gon's desire to become a hunter, but he also arguably had a stronger personal influence on Gon than any other character in the series. It wouldn't even be much of a stretch to say that Kite was more of a father figure to Gon than the boy's actual father. Where Jing was more akin to a goal that needed to be reached, Kite had given Gon important life advice that would help shape the boy's worldview. Gon reinforces this notion by bringing him up on several occasions throughout his journey. The 2011 anime might capture that in a more implicit sense during the Chimera Ant arc, but because he is never mentioned beforehand, that notion falls flat to anyone who hasn't read the manga or seen the original anime. His omission also serves to contradict Gon's honest, outspoken nature. It seems out of character for Gon to neglect that part of his upbringing until this conveniently timed flashback. And for that matter, I find it bizarre that the screenwriters would wait so long to introduce Kite. The Chimera Ant arc began publication in Weekly Shonen Jump back in 2003, so they obviously would have known that Kite was important. Why undercut that level of importance by using a last-minute flashback? I have an answer. Now, keep in mind that I'm not saying the 2011 series handled things particularly well as a whole. However, I would argue that removing Kite from the first episode was a smart decision. The main problem with Kite is not that he doesn't appear in episode 1, but rather that he doesn't appear until the plot physically needs him. So long as Kite's impact on Gon had been established in advance of the Chimera Ant arc, this wouldn't have been an issue. I'll revisit that idea in a bit. But before that, I want to address the strengths of the 2011 anime's first episode, and why I believe it's a stronger introduction than that of its 1999 counterpart. Each episode focuses on three major characters, those being Gon, Kite, and Mito in the 99 series, as opposed to Gon, Leorio, and Kurapika in 2011. Now, I love all of these characters, but when one thinks of Hunter x Hunter, chances are that these two will come to mind far quicker than these two. That's because Kurapika and Leorio are pivotal players in some of the show's biggest arcs. Hell, Kurapika basically becomes the main character for at least one of them. On the other hand, Mito barely does anything, and Kite's significance is based not in his actions, but in how he shaped Gon's morals in the past. So while this version completely outclasses its successor when it comes to Mito's characterization, capped off by an incredibly poignant final scene, there simply isn't as much potential with her. The material isn't superfluous by any means. In fact, it's in keeping with Togashi's tendency to flesh out minor characters. But by the end of that episode, Gon is the only major character who gets any significant screen time. He gets plenty of time to shine in the 2011 anime as well, but on top of that, the mechanics of the Hunter exam begin popping up, Kurapika expounds upon his backstory in a well-crafted dialogue sequence, Leorio is Leorio. There's just so much more going on that could pique your interest in this version. And because these characters will remain on screen for quite some time after this, the following material can immediately build off of what happens here. The 1999 adaptation doesn't have that momentum right off the bat. Mito and Kite won't appear again until much later, and Gon still has to meet Leorio and Kurapika, the latter of whom doesn't actually interact with the two until episode 3. It's a slower, somewhat awkward introduction that the 2011 series blows right past. By the latter's third episode, Gon and company had already passed the old lady's quiz, passed the Kiriko test, and met up with the rest of the applicants for phase 1 of the exam. Some people would argue that the 2011 anime rushes through these events, but if you see my previous video on the series, you'll understand why I don't agree with that sentiment. Kite's introduction has little to do with these events, so while the original's first episode was more faithful to the manga, it actually ends up hurting the early portion of the story in my opinion. The manga can get away with it due to its easily consumable format, but the 99 anime only exaggerates this issue by adding in filler. I'll save the quality debate of that for my in-depth side-by-side breakdown of the two shows. But regardless of its quality, I don't think it's a necessary addition to the series. I like slow-burning shows, but in this instance, I don't think the pacing trade-off is worth it. So Kite is out of episode 1, but I still want to introduce him well before the Chimera Ant arc. Where do I put him now? My ideal choice would be right after Hisoka punches Gon in the Hunter exam. For a bit of context, the 1999 anime adds in a scene that shows Gon suffering from the effects of the poisoned blow dart. This plays into that adaptation's take on his character, where Gon has more moments of vulnerability and less of typical shonen badassery. Following this scene, Gon joins up with his friends to help Leorio hunt his target, but his reason for doing so is much more dramatic. In both the manga and 2011 anime, Gon decides to help his friends to ease his frustration and validate his self-worth. The same can be said in this version, only the severity of the situation is far greater. Gon's encounter with Hisoka shakes him so badly that he abandons his tags before reuniting with his comrades. He doubts that he currently has the abilities required of a hunter, and because of that, he decides that he doesn't deserve to pass. It's only after he rescues his friends that he dispels that doubt and goes back to retrieve his tags. This adds an extra layer of tension to this phase of the exam, and digs into Gon's personality a bit. But because it's filler, even though it's really good, I wouldn't expect the 2011 series to replicate it. Instead, the writers could have integrated Kite's flashback into this scene to achieve a somewhat similar purpose. This memory could have played into the introspective mood of the moment, and simultaneously reaffirmed Gon's desire to become a hunter.
闇の中で一人何を思う?
I mean, the potential is right there. Episode 16 ends, start episode 17 with a flashback. If that disrupts the pacing too much, you could at least throw in a few brief cuts to Kite without context. At least then you'd be planting the seeds for a later introduction. Another potential option would be during Gon and Killua's conversation on Whale Island. The boys are already discussing their upbringings and motivations, and since Killua will eventually meet Kite later on, this could be a cool way to build some anticipation for that encounter, both for Killua and the audience. If you had only shown a few brief flashes of Kite in episode 16 or 17, this could have been the payoff to that, some more elaboration on what those flashbacks meant. I'm sure there are a few other moments where you could integrate the flashback, but I feel like these two would be the most seamless. And because they're moments from fairly early on, Kite's importance in the Khmer Ant arc wouldn't feel like it came from seemingly out of nowhere. Of course, beyond just showing this flashback, it would also be a good idea to have Gon bring up Kite in conversation a few times. The 99 anime has a scene shortly after the climax of the Hunter exam where Gon alludes to Kite yet again. And there are a bunch of other little tiny instances of that where Gon just kind of hints at Kite, hints at his existence and his importance. The 2011 anime has none of that, and that's why it's a major issue, because it really does feel like Kite just comes from out of nowhere. So how would you fix the Kite problem? I know the easy answer is to just follow the manga, just do what the manga did, but I don't feel as though adaptations should just be carbon copies of the manga. If you want to do something a little different, I actually would encourage that, and that's why, in this video, I wanted to pose some alternate suggestions beyond just, oh, the 99 anime is better because it followed the manga, it was more faithful to the manga. Or at least in the first episode it did. What makes the 99 anime so distinct is that it doesn't follow the manga as a one-to-one adaptation. And while some of the film isn't very good, some of the film is great. And it's interesting to see a different spin on the Hunter x Hunter story, because that way you can at least tell that whoever's creating this thing is putting their own perspective into it. That's the problem that some of these adaptations from other media can have, is that they don't add anything new to the project that they're presenting. Some could argue that the 2011 anime early on plays it a little too straight to the manga. Again, I won't dig too deep into that right now. I mainly just wanted to get this video out first as a discussion, because I know everybody's gonna ask me about, oh, if you're gonna compare the two shows, then how do you feel about Kite? But I also couldn't really think of a good way to integrate it into the comparison without it just being a giant tangent, so it's getting its own video. But enough about the Kite problem, let's talk about the real issue. Let's talk about the Kon problem.